Okay, moving on to humanistic theories of personality. We've moved on from Freud, but a humanistic theory, just like a lot of theories in the 20th century having to do with personality, it kind of grew as a response to Freud. Freud kind of came first, and he was very influential, and a lot of people disagreed with some aspect of his writings, his proposals, his arguments. And so a lot of great ideas came about from people trying to propose alternatives to your Freudian understanding of personality. Freud was generally criticized for being very deterministic, the idea that you essentially have no free will, no control over yourself. It's this id that's controlling you, or your unconscious processes controlling you. And also he had a generally negative view of human nature. The idea was that, underneath everything we were this horrible animalistic creature that needed to be kept in check. And other people had a more positive view of human nature. And the humanists, or the humanistic theorists, they definitely fall into this category. They believe that humans were inherently good, and so they didn't like that negative tone to Freud's writings, his theories. And so there are two big names in the humanistic perspective. Before we get into those two big names, let's talk about general ideas that you see in the humanistic perspective. All right, so first of all, it's a holistic approach. Human beings are more than just the sum of their parts. We've heard this before when we talked about Gestalt or Gestalt psychology, that you've got a whole person. They are not just their individual parts, they're individual units. So it's a different way of describing people, of looking at their behavior, analyzing their behavior, and performing therapy, because these are also, there's humanistic therapy too. And another thing that's different, so in addition to being more holistic, they believe in focusing on the present. Freud was very much about going into the past and figuring out what things happened to you to shape your now behavior. The humanists were much more focused on what is going on in your life right now. What's your behavior right now? What is driving you right now? So they were much more present-oriented and very different from Freud. Freud was all about the unconscious. The humanists focused on the conscious. They believed that consciousness, the stuff you're aware of, consciousness is the most important level of awareness. So this is a big difference here. They said, we need to talk about the stuff you can describe. We don't need to delve into your unconsciousness. We don't need to do things like dream interpretation and projective testing and anything like that. No, we need to just talk to you about what you're doing in your life. You have access to your conscious behavior, your conscious thoughts. Let's focus on that. Now, they also believe that every person has value. They're not dismissive of anybody. Everybody has potential. Everybody has value. Everybody is worthy of respect. Those sorts of concepts. Everybody is capable of growth. All right, so it's a more optimistic approach. Now, finally, in general, the humanistic perspectives includes the idea that the goal of life is personal growth. You can always be a better version of yourself, essentially. All right. So those are your general ideas within the humanistic perspective. Who are your two big names here? We've got Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. And so let's see. I'm going to start with Maslow. All right. So Maslow, he proposed a lot of things. We're going to do the brief, short, basic version of things. One thing that we get from him that he talked a lot about was this idea of self-actualization. Self-actualization, this has to do with that idea of personal growth, of trying to be a better version of yourself. So this is an individual's experience of becoming their real self, rather than striving for their ideal self, accepting their real self, being the best true them that they can be, and realizing their fullest potential as a human being. That has to do with meeting their needs, moving up to higher levels of accomplishment, of getting closer to actualization. And I'm checking the textbook for this class right now. Okay, so your textbook does not include this one image that's often associated with Maslow. He had kind of this pyramid, this hierarchy of needs. And obviously you're not going to have to memorize it because it's not in the book. But just there was the idea that you had certain basic needs that had to be fulfilled before you can get to those higher level needs, and definitely before you could get to self-actualization. So basic needs at the bottom, that includes things like food, shelter. Like if you don't have enough to eat, if you don't have a place to sleep, you're not going to be working on self-actualization. You're not going to be working on, your spiritual needs when your survival needs need to be met. So that's another idea that we get from Maslow. Now, the other big name is Carl Rogers, and Carl Rogers is known for developing a type of therapy called person-centered therapy. And when we talk about Rogers, we have to talk about something called self-concept. And this is basically the way a person would describe themselves is how I describe it for like children when I teach developmental psychology. So a person's understanding of who he or she or they are, and it's reflected in the way an individual thinks of themselves. Basically, what do you think of yourself? How would you describe yourself? Do you describe yourself positively, negatively? Do you acknowledge your strengths and weaknesses? Are you realistic in describing yourself? Are you critical in describing yourself? All sorts of things can go into your self-concept, how you see yourself. Now, Rogers also believed in something, the power of something called unconditional positive regard. You might have heard the term unconditional love. This is that same basic concept, except he's using, different terminology. Positive regard. Do you like somebody no matter what they do? Sometimes you have conditional affection or something like that, where it's like, hey, I like you as long as you don't, as long as you don't vote differently than me, as long as you don't get fat, something like that. That's conditional. Rogers wouldn't approve of that. And so this is the ability to accept and value another person despite their problems or weaknesses. You are an imperfect person. I still like you. We are all imperfect in some way. We all have flaws. With unconditional positive regard, it's like, okay, we know your flaws. I still like you. I still want to help you. I still approve of you in general. All right. Now, if you don't engage in this unconditional positive regard, you give people conditions of worth. So conditions of worth, this is like, as long as you don't do this one thing. Internalizing message, that's an internalizing message that suggests conditions, rules, things you have to accomplish before people will like you, that one must meet before they are accepted by another person. That person who believes, okay, if I get plastic surgery, that person will like me. They've internalized some conditions of worth. The condition is you must be beautiful or you must look a certain way. And it develops when someone does not experience unconditional positive regard. So you're probably familiar with the idea that parents are often encouraged to give their children this unconditional positive regard. Like, hey, I was a big high school athlete, not me personally. This is an example. I was a big high school athlete. My child does not want to become an athlete. They're not even interested in sports. If you're providing unconditional positive regard, you're like, oh, that's okay. I want you to be the best you that you possibly can be. I accept you as you are, even though I don't get it, even though it's not what I'm into or what I can relate to. All right. And we actually do have evidence, a very simple statement, very brief summary. We do have evidence for the power of unconditional acceptance of loved ones in your life. All right, now what else? Oh, we also have something very important for Carl Rogers, and this has to do with whether your ideal self matches your actual self. And I don't know if we've talked about this in this class. I've talked about it in another class recently, so it's ringing in my head like, oh, hey, we talked about this. Your ideal self is like what you see as the best you could possibly be, or in some cases, what you should be. If you just worked harder, what could you become? What could you accomplish? Your actual self is your actual self concept, how you actually see yourself. Well, Rogers proposed that you would have problems in your functioning and the way you viewed yourself if there was too much of a mismatch. Too much of a mismatch between the actual self and the ideal self. That would be incongruence. Incongruence is where they don't overlap. Incongruence is where your actual self is very different than your ideal self. The thing is, who controls that ideal self? You do. Sometimes therapy can involve getting someone to adjust their idea of their ideal self, adjust their idea of what they think they should be. All right, so if you accept your actual self, if your actual self matches with your ideal self, then you have congruence. Congruence, you get harmony, and you have better functioning, and that's something to strive for. All right, so those are your basic ideas with humanistic perspectives on personality. You want to take more? Take a class on personality. I don't know if I mentioned it, but on my campus we do have a senior level class on personality that a lot of students find interesting.